You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 32. By the time Valorian's lighthouse drew Starspeed in, the city's edge had come alive with its nightlife. Garen's men itched to disembark, but they didn't dare grumble about their duties keeping them from immediately entering the taverns. With Valorian's reputation, they'd still have plenty of time to gamble away the money they'd just earned. Garen, on the other hand, felt time slipping through his fingers as they docked. It had taken far too long to reach the city. Where had Daisy gone in the last week? Had she stayed here? Aura stood at the edge of the boat with a proud serenity that only made Garen more anxious. The wind lifted the hair around her cheeks, billowing her skirt until she looked like some sort of sea goddess carved on the boat's prow come to life. By her side, Lenda gripped the railing, fingers as white as her face. Despite gaining minimal sea legs, she remained weak. Garen fought the empathy rising in his chest, knowing it was a trick of the bond. He'd grown to care more for her in the last few days, felt urges to bring her food or extra blankets. Instead of giving in to those urges, he'd resisted them, swallowing down his growing interest in order to remain focused. Sometimes it felt like more work than it was worth. As Larkos hopped onto the deck to tie Starspeed in, Garen assisted Aura and Lenda across. By the time the men had secured the ship, had their fun, and returned to their duties, it would be morning, and Garen hoped to be back on Starspeed, questions answered, maybe even with a third woman on board to further annoy his superstitious crew. When Riverin offered to come along, Garen only agreed because he could still hear his sister's haunted words reverberating in his mind. If he wasn't going to follow all her advice, at least he could heed this one pointless request. Riverin kept the healed X on his forehead hidden by a cap pulled low over his brow, which was a good thing because Gullet already attracted far too much attention. Aura stiffly allowed the traitor to escort her through the streets, her awareness of the city's dangers most likely overriding her preferred solitude. Lenda clung to Garen's arm like a leech, nails biting into his skin even through his sleeve. Breeve's face was bright red as he escorted Lenda's maid. The deeper they walked into town, the thicker the crowds grew. The cobblestone roads echoed with the clip-clop of hooves and the tap of heels. Laughter rang out between fiddles and hornpipes, and Garen had to sidestep more than one group of rowdy men sloshing more ale than they took in. They passed a dozen taverns and inns that Garen refused to consider, the ramshackle buildings held together with patches of grout and mismatched stones. They all took a deep breath when they'd left behind the worst parts of town, entering the less lively but still awake areas. The buildings seemed to grow taller and straighter, their smooth surfaces evidence of the tenants' affluence. The streets held half the revelers and half the volume, the celebrations muted in comparison. Aura finally relaxed enough to stretch out a hand, tracing the buildings they passed as if feeling for the presence of the people inside. Garen bit his cheek to hold back his questions, knowing they would only make Lenda ask things he wasn't ready to explain. They reached the Knight's Light Inn, where Garen sent Breve back to his duties, and Lenda half-heartedly fought Garen's insistence that she and her maid get checked in for the night. The moment the innkeeper's wife brought up a hot bath, Lenda's protests ceased. Even Aura's face took on a hint of longing, but the expression was quickly replaced by determination, and she left with Riverin and Garen. Where to now? Garen asked, his tongue looser without Lenda's listening ears. The edge of town. I can't sense anything with all the noise. Aura's gaze drifted to the mountains in the east, which were barely visible in the moonlight. The farthest range housed Lover's Falls. You don't think they're here? Aura shrugged. It's doubtful. Why come all this way just to find another tavern to get lost in another drink? Garen frowned, irritated by her nonchalance. He was starting to wonder if she spoke in riddles as a distraction. Maybe she didn't actually have all the answers. Is she still? Garen cut off, glancing at Riverin, who shoved his hands in his pockets and matched their long strides. He wasn't reacting, but Garen knew he was taking in every detail. He'd always been one to listen with little comment. Garen leaned in, blocking Riverin out from the conversation. Can you tell if it's still with the girl? Is she still with the two people using blood magic? She hesitated. I can't. I'm not sure. I still sense the human and. A human? Garen's eyebrows rose. He was the fourth to cross. How long would a human last in this part of the world? He supposed they were no different from the half-lights without starlocks, just men and women with powerless blood. But who knew for certain? Anticipation brewed beneath his compulsion to find Daisy. If it weren't for his obligation to find her and protect her, this was the kind of adventure that would distract him. Finding the Starbridge and traveling to other lands, meeting long-lost people groups. He would still use it to protect Daisy, but maybe he could also use it to convince Enla she needed an ambassador to the other lands more than a throne warden. If nothing else, she would see the Starbridge as a desirable source of power and authority. Aura's question came back to Garen, making him instantly contrite. Did that make Enla the kind of person who wanted to use the Starbridges to make the world smaller? Did it make Garen that kind of person if he wanted to use them for his own freedom from the crown? Aura would probably want him to think about what he could learn from the humans living in Lorvandas, or what he could offer them, instead of how he could benefit. She stopped, turning slowly to look at him. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and without thought, he drew energy from his blood, wrapping it around his mind like a shield, certain she'd been listening to his thoughts. Her power's strength and place on the wheel still remained a mystery to him, and he'd foolishly started leaving his guard down. She didn't pass through here, Aura whispered, her face growing troubled. Once again, she bent to her knees, shoving her hands in the earth, heedless of the wet soil soaking into her dress. They'd finally reached the edge of town, several fields the only thing separating them from the forest and eventual mountains. Garen let out a breath. She'd been listening to something else then. Except maybe this was worse. Had they lost Daisy and the Starbridge completely? So you were wrong on the island? Can you still track it? She tilted her head, eyes closed. Moonlight glowed soft on her skin, a strange trick of the light. Garen snuck a glance at Riverin, whose fascination mirrored Garen's own. It's faint. They're near Lover's Falls, if I had to venture a guess. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, but the uncertainty etched between her brows bothered Garen far more than the mud being flung on his pants. A guess? Garen's laugh held no humor. You expect me to abandon my ship and follow a faint trail based on a guess? Her eyes flashed with anger, but her voice remained eerily calm. I expect you to go after any chance if the price is right. How much do you want the things you seek? She raised a brow, her question holding some deeper meaning. She wasn't just asking if he wanted to find Daisy and the Starbridge. Whether she knew it or not, she was asking if he wanted to fix the mistakes of his past and secure protection for the future. Enla's warning rang through his mind. He had no problem going to Lover's Falls, especially if it could help him find Eliana, but somehow the warning held more weight if approaching the sprites was Aura's idea instead of his. If you have other methods of tracking, she added, I'm more than willing to part ways. I no longer need your services. Her chin rose, a spitting image of Enla dismissing servants. Riverin hid his face, but Karyne knew he was being laughed at. By the traitorous fool who'd shunned his sister, no less. He clamped his jaw, unsuccessfully attempting to match Aura's cool. I just want to know how accurate your guess might be. I'm already going to be a week late returning home. If I follow your guess, I'm guaranteed to miss the dignitaries Enla wants me home for. Enla would never forgive him. His father would berate him as a sorry excuse for a throne warden. And what about his mother? Had her health improved or declined? How long could he safely stay away? Aura gazed across the fields, her eyes locked on the mountains rising in the northeast, silhouetted by the quarter moon. She was never here, which makes it more difficult. I sense she passed near here and headed that way. She pointed to the mountains where Karyne knew Lover's Falls to be. But the trail will grow cold if we wait. I suggest we leave now. Now? As in tonight? Riverin finally spoke, his wide eyes turning to Karyne. Karyne swallowed hard. It felt like she was bent on making a fool out of him, seeing how far he was willing to go. Maybe even trying to get him to give up so she could resume the chase on her own. But what if this was his only chance? You think Lover's Falls is their ultimate destination? He asked, stalling. Perhaps. I sense their path veering from the well-traveled roads, whether for haste or concealment. Her gaze remained on the distant hills. I can't just leave, Karyne said. A trip through Southern Territory and its recreants required planning. Karyne was just as likely to be recognized and assassinated as he was to get answers. Then stay, Aura said. And I will leave. Karyne and Riverin exchanged a look. Riverin leaned in. What exactly are you tracking? Larkos made it sound like you were on a treasure hunt, but Aura's been talking about people. Is this about... He trailed off, eyebrows raised. Even with their friendship long dead, he didn't give up Daisy's name in front of a stranger. Karyne bit the inside of his cheek. If he told Riverin everything, he wouldn't have to make the decision alone. But even if he had time to explain it all, he wasn't ready to share it with Riverin. Not now, maybe not ever. He turned back to Aura without answering Riverin. I need to at least send word to Larkos. It wasn't a lie, but it also wasn't the only thing Karyne planned to do. Aura shrugged. Be quick. Stay with her, Karyne instructed Riverin even as he backed away toward town. Riverin's surprise shifted to a glare, and he opened his mouth. That's an order. Karyne took off in the night, not waiting for Riverin's protest. He couldn't completely trust Riverin, but he also couldn't trust Aura, which meant he had to verify her story. He pulled the hood of his cloak up, tight around his face, then headed for the taverns closest to the docks. As he walked, he recounted in his mind his conversation with Aura, an unpleasant truth dawning on him. Riverin was right. Aura no longer talked about tracing the Star Bridge's location. She talked about tracing Daisy. So if Daisy was what the woman was really after, what exactly did she plan to do when she found her? It took 3 taverns for Karyne to get what he needed. After walking through the crowds and tuning in to the memories of dozens of people around him, he honed in on one young stable boy, whose excitement over the events of the week before still lingered in his mind. The boy's eyes shone as he watched a group of rowdy men sloshing beer and singing ballads, joining in for the parts he knew. Karyne sidled up to the boy's table, allowing the crowd to jostle him until their arms brushed. He apologized, but didn't move his arm, leaning harder as if the crowd forced him off balance. The boy edged away, but in a distracted manner, like he was making room for Karyne. Their contact didn't break, and Karyne tuned in to the boy's memories, flowing through them in reverse until he hit the points he needed. 3 strangers approaching the blacksmith, leather cords around the one woman's neck. The boy's heart rate increasing as he inched forward, knowing this would be a story for his friends. The travelers exchanging coin for a dozen horses, maybe more. The boy hadn't learned his numbers well. Karyne couldn't hold the memory enough to catch details on faces, but the boy remained fixated on the leather cord, hoping for a glimpse of the woman's starlock. It wasn't enough for Karyne to be sure. He needed the boy to think of more details. "You work for the blacksmith?" Karyne asked. The boy jumped, then nodded, his gaze darting around the room as if holding a job was a crime. "I need 3 horses. Think your boss is still awake?" The boy laughed, then tried to cover the action. "Course, but not likely sober." He pointed across the room to where a bearded man downed half a glass of ale before belting out the last line of the song, slurring the words. "Ah, I see." Karyne smiled at the boy. "Are you able to help me then?" The boy shook his head. "He sold 'em all. That's why he's still celebrating." The boy leaned forward. "The buyer was a progeny, and one of the men with her had webbed fingers. Gave my boss double what they were worth." "A progeny? And another with webbed fingers?" Karyne didn't have to feign his interest. Know what they were doing this far from the schools? The boy shook his head. "They weren't students. I guess maybe they could be teachers. They seemed worried, though." Karyne tuned in to the memories the boy recalled as he spoke, honing in on the words spoken by the travelers. Despite their blurry faces and the boy's inability to recall much detail, Karyne caught one phrase that took his breath away. "She needs it for Eliana." Karyne replayed the memory in his head, his grip tightening on the boy's arm until the boy wrenched free. "I said let go!" The boy's cry rang out through the room between songs, and curious gazes turned their way. "Forgive me," Karyne said, half bowing as he backed away. He scanned the crowd, noting Thalahan and Breve among the revelers. The 2 sailors stood a little taller, recognizing him as well. The crowd murmured, debating if they could safely return to their normal evening activities, and wary eyes followed Karyne as he made his exit. How long would it take for someone to recognize him as Prince? He stepped out into the night air, which was only a fraction less stuffy than the crowded tavern. The travelers were with Daisy. He bent over, hands on his knees. It proved that Aura was right. They'd passed by here, gathered supplies. It was just like Aura had said. But there was a progeny in their midst. Not half-lights using blood magic. Had Aura been lying or just mistaken about that detail? He reached for his dagger, running his thumb over the daisy. He took a deep breath and let the grooves soothe his fears, as if the dagger's security was tied to Daisy's. The door opened behind Karyne, and Thalahan and Breve tumbled out, brows furrowed. "Captain?" Thalahan asked. "Is everything all right?" Karyne shook his head. "I'm not sure. I need to find Larkos, but I think I need to check on Aura first." "We can come." Thalahan's response was immediate, reassuring. Not the bartering answer of hired help. "Follow me." Karyne took off through the town. Breve and Thalahan weaved through the streets behind him, guided toward the edge of town by a sudden, eerie wail. "Is that a Winnex?" Breve asked, voice hushed. Karyne wanted to say yes, but it sounded far too human. When they exited the last alley and found themselves at the edge of town, Riverin kneeled over Aura, the woman curled up in a ball. "What happened?" Karyne ran the last several feet. Riverin held up his hands defensively. "Nothing. I don't know. Her hands were in the dirt and she let out an awful noise, and she hasn't moved since." Karyne dropped down next to Riverin, reaching for Aura, then hesitated, remembering how she didn't want him touching her. But this time she grasped his wrist, and her eyes flew open, a desperate fear transferring from deep within her to Karyne, the sensation as forceful as a fist to his gut. "It's consuming her," Aura said. "What's consuming her?" Karyne tried shaking off Aura's grip, but she held tight, too tight. "The magic. It's killing her."
Chapter 33. The trail grew muddy as Eliana drew closer to the waterfall, and the spray of water soaked her legs, the sensation more refreshing than chilling between her hike and her body's blood still practically boiling with its energy. She pressed the hem of her skirt into her wound, staunching the flow, but her body refused to completely heal it. Her mind still warred over all the ways she could use her blood for magic. Maybe she could use it to best the sprites. Maybe she could defeat the dark spirits. They still darted in the sky above her, inching ever closer, spurring her on faster. If she gave in to her desire for blood magic, she wouldn't be able to hold back its power. She'd give herself over to the dark spirits. Without warning, a winged creature half her height hovered before Eliana, red as the blood seeping between her fingers. A trill of notes came from the slits of its nose, and the fast flutter of its wings left Eliana stunned, her breath hitching even as her lungs struggled to keep up with her efforts. The creature's small head and bulbous eyes resembled a butterfly's, but its body had arms and legs like the Winnick's, shrunken and shriveled, like a child not fully formed. Still, far too human-like. The creature flew away faster than her eyes could follow, snapping Eliana out of her reverie. It disappeared up the trail on the side of the waterfall, revealing a small alcove behind the spray, almost halfway up. Mist soaked Eliana's face and clothes as she hesitated. She turned away, rubbing the water from her face, wondering if the others might come around the bend at any moment in their pursuit. She didn't have time for second thoughts. She continued the climb, practically blinded by the water's spray. Her entire body was soaked by the time she reached the gap where the wall of the cliff met the raging waterfall. A wall of liana vines blocked her path, but after seeing the creature disappear here, she knew not to trust her eyes. She pushed against the ropey branches, careful to avoid their thorns. Eventually, the vines had some give, and the branches swung like a curtain that she divided and stepped behind. The vines closed after her, the only source of illumination, the moonlight peeking between the leaves. Water dripped deep within, making it difficult to determine the size of the cave. A floral scent reached her nose, maybe an orchid or hyacinth, but was quickly overpowered by something rotting. She swept back the liana vines, wincing as thorns dug into her flesh. The extra moonlight revealed two skeletons resting in an embrace, the lovers of Lovers' Falls. Inside their rib cages, something had formed a nest, the bones of recently picked over animals mingled with shriveled plants. Cockroaches spilled out, escaping across her boots to a darker part of the cavern. She jumped back with a gasp, her back bumping into the powerful yet tiny hands of the blood-red winged creature. It spun her around to face its big black eyes. Cold fear swept through Eliana. She no longer heard sweet music. On the heels of her fear, warmth seeped into her skin, heat from the starlock and blood, a reminder that she could use it to fight back. "Do you know what I am?" The voice held the same melody as the creature's song. Still, no mouth moved, the tones resonating more in Eliana's mind. Its head simply cocked, waiting for her reply. Yes? It had to be a sprite, even if it wasn't how she'd pictured it. "What is it you seek?" Its eyes blinked, and a shiny film coated them. It blinked again, and the film disappeared. Eliana licked her lips. There were a number of answers she could give. She'd come to get freedom from her magic, but now that she was here, covered in her own powerful blood, with this sprite, she wasn't sure if it was what she wanted anymore. There were far greater causes. She had a mother who was in danger, a friend who needed to get home, an entire people group who suffered from oppression. Ah, do not lie. Everyone who finds the sprites is offered what they seek. Its head tilted the other way, the sharp motion leaving Eliana uneasy. It's not always what they want. The warning slid through Eliana like a snake, unsettling everything it touched. Did it know what she was thinking? Maybe she didn't want anything from these sprites. She squeezed her hands into fists, relishing the sensation of blood dripping onto the mossy rock, then hating herself for gaining any pleasure. She'd tried weaning herself from the blood magic, but it was too dangerous. She could do more for Cyrus, for her mother, for her new friends, if she didn't have to deal with weaning her magic. Holm and Iris contributed plenty without starlocks and magic. She'd never wanted magic to begin with. I seek freedom from the magic in my blood. She pulled the star-shaped starlock and its leather cord over her head, settling it on the ground between her and the sprite, like some sort of offering. I want to be rid of it all. The request felt right as it left her lips. If she didn't have magic, Mavis would never be able to use her blood. The sprite tilted its head again. The space beneath its eyes shifted, like cheeks rising on a smiling face. The sprite seemed pleased, which somehow made it more menacing. Eliana took a step back. Freedom. The sprite bent to examine the starlock, its wings flapping to hold the creature in place at such an odd angle. Such a noble request comes at a high price. Eliana took another step back, but her boot crunched against bone. She shuddered, hands bracing for the edge of the liana curtain. Could she run from this creature? Did she dare try? Ah, yes. The sprite blinked again, the film once more covering the glossy black of its eyes. You can obtain your freedom at the cost of another's. I keep this trinket, and you never feel the weight of your magic again. A blink, and the black eyes returned. The sprite breathed in deep, the slits between its eyes expanding. A rush of pain, Then relief flowed through the cut on Eliana's arm, until it was sealed. She reached out to the wall of vines for support, even though a thorn cut her other hand. The absence of the magic's pressure and temptation nearly made her crumple. It wasn't completely gone, not like when Arvid and Vera had drained her, but the surplus settled into a pleasant, controllable hum. And it only costs the freedom of one mortal. The sprite's slim shoulder lifted and dropped. Not even a powerful one. An image of Cyrus flashed before her, his innocent freckled face pale, lips blue. For a moment, she recognized it as a memory, a vision from her awakening, but it was too vivid to be a recollection. The sprite had pushed the image into her mind, had given it to her as easily as she'd given it the Starlock. No. She clenched her shaking hands. The price is too high. The sprite cocked its head again. No? Its cheeks lowered. Its bulging eyes blinked once more. The film remained, the image of Cyrus growing hazier. The sprite leaned forward, draping the leather cord over Eliana's head until the starlock settled around her neck. For a moment, the creature's nearness had a sinister pause. Its wings beat like a loud drum in her ear. Its hot breath drifted across her face from its enlarged nostrils, and its fingers tightened on the cord. It could kill her in that instant with just the leather around her neck. Maybe it wanted to. A buzzing sound filled the space, followed by the iridescent glow of a dozen sprites rounding the corner from the depths of the cave. Their wings fluttered in a rainbow of golds, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies. She froze as they rushed toward her, realizing this hauntingly beautiful image was likely the last thing she'd ever see. Instead, the red sprite spun her to face the vines. The moment you asked for the deal, you'd already taken it. Its voice no longer held music, just a deep growl filled with hatred. Your freedom or his. Dozens of little hands pressed on her back, shoving her through the vines, which sliced at her arms and face. Her boots slipped on wet rock, then lost purchase as the sprites pushed her through the waterfall and beyond. The scream erupting from Eliana's throat was drowned out by a mouth full of water. She spluttered as the shock of weightlessness overpowered her, and the black of night swirled with cerulean water and thick leaves. Before she could regain any sense of direction or reclaim more air, her body plunged into water. It filled her nose, and her proximity to the waterfall pushed her deeper, churning her beneath its force. She fought against its power, lungs burning, but that only kept her revolving within the water. Her vision dimmed, the fight draining from her body. As she went limp, the current finally carried her out from under the waterfall, where she could sense up from down. Breaking through the surface, she sucked in fresh, hopeful air, hacking and spitting out water. The current took her nearer to the shore, her now bare feet scraping the sandy bottom. But in the water, her hands brushed against fabric, skin, and hair, and her heart stilled. Moonlight glinted off the water, leaving the heavy object before her in shadow. She blinked the water from her eyes, pushing aside familiar long red hair with trembling fingers. "Please, no." Her words came out like a desperate prayer as she fought to turn Cyrus over. Blue lips and wide eyes left her sick. "Help!" The word left her mouth at a fraction of the volume needed, but her body couldn't produce anything louder. She hooked her arms under his and dragged him to the water's edge. His weight became unbearable as his body hit the sand, and she collapsed against his still form, water lapping at their legs. "Sweet stars, no!" She pulled at the fabric clinging to his chest, trying to remember the motions she'd once seen a healer do with a little girl who had drowned in the creek. Something to make the heart beat, to pump the water out. But she wasn't a healer. She didn't know what to do. She bent forward, placing her forehead against his cold skin. It was her fault. He'd been doomed since the day they'd met. She'd always known it, and still, she'd led him into the trap like an animal to a butcher. "This isn't what I wanted." She pulled back, the starlock miraculously still hanging from her neck, swinging between them. The sprites had tricked her. She didn't want their deal. She turned to the waterfall, glaring at the space where she knew the creatures waited, probably watching. "I told you no!" Her shout echoed across the water, her voice finally regaining its force. She turned back to Cyrus. "The cost of freedom is too high." She yanked the cord from her neck, and at her touch, the starlock pulsed, not unlike the blood pumping through Eliana's veins. "Your freedom or his?" The sprite's words came back to her, taunting her, but also guiding her. It was her choice, her freedom or his life or hers. In order to save him, she had to give up the freedom she craved. She had to use her magic. She closed her eyes, squeezing the starlock tight in her right hand while placing her left across her face, which oozed with blood from the vines that had sliced into her skin. Arvid and Vera had always spoken of manipulating the elements, forcing substances to obey their commands. It had sounded clumsy and imprecise. Instead, she recalled Silmar's words of altering the elements, enhancing them. She focused on the beat of her heart, the pumping of her blood, the energy pushing through every drop in her veins. She placed her hands on his chest and willed the energy out from her blood and into the water around her, reaching for the water deep within Cyrus's lungs. She sensed it then, on a level deeper than knowledge or understanding, intuition that went beyond the senses, a need to pull the water out and replace it with air, to press the energy in until his heart could once more beat, to heal the parts of his body already damaged. Even with her eyes closed, they lit up in her mind's eye like points in a constellation, targets to direct the power constantly threatening to spill out of her. For the first time, she purposely let her energy flow out, uninhibited, the power expanding within her even as it left her body. It unfurled like a cat stretching, filling her veins before pumping out. She gasped as it wrenched through her, opening her eyes as her palm filled with heat. When Arvid and Vera had drained her, the power only flowed out. But with the Starlock, power also flowed in. The source felt frighteningly bottomless, and in her panic, she pushed the energy out faster. The heat of the Starlock seared against her palm, like the starting point of a string running through Eliana's body and extending out to Cyrus's lungs. Cyrus coughed and sputtered, his body racking in the sand until he turned and retched, breaking the connection between them. Eliana's sense of relief was quickly overshadowed by her inability to control the energy she released. It backed up along the string, filling Eliana once more, bloating her with its painful presence. She opened her hand and released the Starlock, practically batting it to the pebbles on the shore. As Cyrus sat up, Eliana crumpled to the sand, the pain now filling her lungs like the water had filled his. A figure ran down the beach, slipping in the sand. Eliana fought to stay awake, to know if the stranger would help Cyrus or harm him. But the unfamiliar man rushed for her, bending to cradle her head with his tattooed hands, to say words she couldn't hear. The light of the moon winked out, hidden behind the dark spirits coming straight for Eliana. Her vision dimmed, her body too weak to warn either man of the coming danger. I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might enjoy listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where Paeter and I narrate fantasy short stories from a variety of authors to help you find your next favorite author. Check it out at findingfantasyreads.com. Thanks so much for listening.